The lake was supposed to be our safe place. Growing up, my older brother Dave and I spent almost every summer at that lake. Our grandparents owned a small cabin nearby, and it was our tradition to camp out there for a few nights every year. It was quiet, peaceful, and far from the noise of the city. When Dave suggested we go back there for a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the chance. It had been years since we'd visited, and life had gotten so busy that we barely spent time together anymore. It was just the two of us this time. No parents, no friends, just us, the lake, and the woods. We arrived on a warm Friday afternoon, the sun shining brightly over the water. The lake looked just as I remembered it, calm and endless, surrounded by thick pine trees. The air smelled of earth and fresh water, and a cool breeze rippled the surface of the lake. We set up our tents near the shore, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the water. After unpacking, we spent the rest of the day fishing, swimming, and laughing about old memories. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Dave lit a campfire. We sat around it, eating the fish we'd caught and watching the stars come out. "This place hasn't changed a bit," I said, staring out at the lake. "Yeah," Dave replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's like time doesn't touch it." The lake was beautiful at night. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the moon and stars above. Everything was calm, quiet, perfect. But then I saw it, a ripple in the water. It started near the middle of the lake and spread outward, like something had broken the surface. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the water. "See what?" Dave asked, looking up. "There was something in the lake," I said, squinting into the darkness. Dave laughed. "Probably just a fish." "Relax." But it didn't feel like a fish. The ripple had been too big, too deliberate. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. As the fire died down, we decided to turn in for the night. Dave went to his tent, but I stayed up a little longer, staring out at the lake. That's when I noticed the shadow. It was faint, almost invisible against the dark water, but it was there, something large and black, just beneath the surface. It moved slowly, circling near the shore. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Dave!" I called out, my voice shaky. "What?" he mumbled from his tent. "There's something in the lake," I said, not taking my eyes off the water. Dave sighed and unzipped his tent. "Seriously? It's probably nothing." He walked over and stood beside me, squinting at the lake. "I don't see anything," he said. "It was there," I insisted. "A shadow under the water." "Look, you're tired," Dave said, patting my shoulder. "Get some sleep. There's nothing out there." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went to my tent, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow circling the lake. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of splashing. It was faint at first, like someone wading into the water. Then it grew louder, more frantic, like something thrashing around. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The lake was still, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. But the splashing continued, coming from somewhere near the middle of the lake. "Dave," I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I turned and looked at his tent. It was empty, the flap hanging open. Panic set in as I ran toward the shore, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. "Dave!" I yelled, my voice echoing across the water. That's when I saw him. He was standing waist-deep in the lake, facing away from me. His arms hung limp at his sides, and he wasn't moving. "Dave!" I shouted again, running to the edge of the water. He didn't respond. "Get out of the water!" I yelled, my heart pounding. "What are you doing?" Slowly, he turned to face me. The sight made my blood run cold. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide and blank, like he was in a trance. Water dripped from his hair and clothes, but he didn't seem to notice. "Dave, come back," I pleaded, stepping into the water. He stared at me for a moment, then slowly raised his arm and pointed toward the center of the lake. I froze, following his gaze. The shadow was back. It was bigger now, darker, and it was moving toward us. "Dave, we have to go," I screamed, grabbing his arm. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, as if snapping out of a dream, he turned and ran with me back to shore. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The lake was silent again, the shadow gone. "What were you doing out there?" I demanded, shaking him. Dave looked at me, his face pale. I don't know," he stammered. I woke up and I heard something. A voice calling me. I thought it was you. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat by the fire, watching the lake and jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. Neither of us looked back at the lake. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Dave refuses to talk about it, and we never went back to the lake again. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I dream about the shadow. I see it circling, waiting, and I hear the faint sound of splashing. And in those moments, I wonder, what would have happened if Dave hadn't turned back? What was it that called him into the water? I don't think I'll ever know. But one thing's for sure. The lake isn't the safe place I thought it was. It all started as a fun weekend trip. My friends and I loved hiking and camping, and this time we wanted something different, something off the beaten path. That's how we ended up choosing the Whispering Woods. The woods were infamous in our town. Everyone had heard the stories about people going missing, strange noises at night, and an eerie feeling that made even the bravest hikers turn back. Of course, we didn't believe any of it. It was just a forest, we thought. And besides, we loved a good challenge. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mike, and my cousin Rachel. We packed our gear and drove out early Saturday morning, ready for an adventure. The road to the woods was long and winding, and as we got closer, the scenery changed. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches arching over the road like a tunnel. Even in the daylight, the woods seemed darker than they should have been. "Creepy," Sarah said with a nervous laugh, peering out the window. "It's just trees," Mike replied, smirking. "Don't tell me you're scared already." "Not scared," Sarah shot back. "Just cautious." We parked at the edge of the woods and unloaded our gear. The trailhead was marked with an old, weathered sign that simply read, "Enter at your own risk." Someone had spray painted over the words, but you could still make them out underneath. "Real welcoming," Rachel muttered, adjusting her backpack. "Come on," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's just a hike." The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but the scenery was beautiful. The trees were enormous, their trunks covered in moss, and the forest floor was dotted with wildflowers. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became unnervingly quiet. "Does anyone else feel weird?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I felt it too, a strange heaviness in the air, like the woods were pressing down on us. "Like we're being watched," she said, glancing over her shoulder. Mike laughed. "It's just your imagination. These woods have a reputation, and you're letting it get to you." But I wasn't so sure. We decided to set up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. By the time we finished pitching our tents and building a fire, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As we sat around the fire, eating and talking, the unease I'd felt earlier began to fade. The firelight made the woods feel less intimidating, and we started joking about the stories we'd heard. "Maybe the Whispering Woods is just a place for shy ghosts," Mike said, laughing. "Or maybe they're just waiting for us to fall asleep," Sarah teased, wiggling her fingers like she was casting a spell. We all laughed, but the moment didn't last. As the fire burned low, we began to hear it, a faint sound, just on the edge of hearing. It was soft at first, like the wind rustling through the trees. But as we sat in silence, straining to listen, it grew louder. Whispers, low and unintelligible, like dozens of voices murmuring at once. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers were too rhythmic, too deliberate. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding us. "Maybe it's animals," Sarah said, clutching her jacket. "Animals don't whisper," I said, my heart pounding. We decided to ignore it, telling ourselves it was nothing. But as the night went on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to shift, moving closer and then further away, like something circling our camp. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled by the fire, our flashlights ready, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, Rachel screamed. We all turned to look at her, and she pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "There," she gasped. "I saw someone." We shone our flashlights in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. "You probably imagined it," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. I didn't imagine it, Rachel insisted. There was someone standing there, watching us. We stayed up until dawn, too scared to close our eyes. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and decided to head back. But the trail was gone. We stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the forest. The path we had taken to get here had disappeared, replaced by dense trees and undergrowth. "This doesn't make sense," I said, my voice shaking. "We didn't walk that far off the trail." "We'll find it," Mike said, though he looked as panicked as the rest of us. "We just need to retrace our steps." We spent hours searching, but the forest seemed to change with every turn. Landmarks we'd passed the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. The whispers came back as the day wore on. They were faint at first, but as the sun began to set, they grew louder. "Where are they coming from?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. By nightfall, we were completely lost. We decided to stop and set up camp again, too exhausted to keep searching in the dark. But none of us could relax. The whispers were constant now, surrounding us. Sometimes they sounded close, right behind us, while other times they seemed to fade into the distance. And then there were the figures. They started appearing just beyond the firelight, shadows that seemed to move on their own. They flickered in and out of sight, vanishing when we tried to shine our flashlights on them. "Did you see that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "Let's just keep the fire going," Mike said, his voice shaking. "As long as we stay in the light, we'll be fine." But deep down, we all knew the light wouldn't protect us. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to silence. The whispers were gone, and the fire had burned down to embers. "Guys," I whispered, sitting up. No one answered. I turned on my flashlight, shining it around the camp. Sarah's tent was empty. So was Mike's. "Rachel," I called out, panic rising in my chest. No response. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight beam darting through the trees. That's when I saw them. The shadows. Dozens of them, standing in a circle around the camp. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching me. I grabbed my backpack and ran, not caring which direction I was going. The shadows didn't follow, but the whispers came back, growing louder with every step. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the woods and onto a road. A passing car stopped, and the driver called the police. They found Sarah, Mike, and Rachel 2 days later, wandering through the woods in a daze. They didn't remember anything, just the whispers, the shadows, and then nothing. None of us ever went back to the Whispering Woods. And even now, years later, I still hear the whispers sometimes, faint and far away, like they're calling me back. But I'll never go, because I know if I do, I won't come out again. When I first heard about the Whispering Woods, I laughed it off as just another scary campfire story. Everyone in our small town had heard the rumors, strange whispers, people disappearing, and sightings of things no one could explain. But my friends and I thought it was just that, a story. So, when Jack suggested we camp there for the weekend, we all jumped at the idea. It sounded like an adventure, something we could brag about later. "We'll prove it's just a bunch of nonsense," he said, grinning as he packed his bag. There were 5 of us, me, Jack, Sarah, Mike, and Laura. We were close friends who had been camping together for years. We weren't afraid of the woods or the dark, and we definitely didn't believe in ghosts. The hike to the campsite was beautiful. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us like giants. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting golden light on the ground. We joked and laughed as we walked, the air filled with the smell of pine and earth. We found a clearing near a small stream and set up our tents. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for the night. Jack told us the story of the Whispering Woods again, trying to scare us. "They say the woods can talk to you," he began, his voice low and dramatic. "That it knows your name, your secrets. People say they've heard whispers, calling them deeper into the forest. And if you follow the whispers," he paused, letting the firelight dance on his face, "you never come back." Yeah, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Is that supposed to scare us?" "Come on, it's just a story," Mike added, throwing a stick into the fire. "We've been camping for years. Nothing's ever happened to us." But as the night grew darker, something about the forest began to change. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like voices. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, soft, faint, like someone whispering my name. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around the fire. "Hear what?" Laura asked, her brow furrowed. "It sounded like someone whispering." Jack laughed. "You're just spooked because of the story." But the whispers didn't stop. They were so quiet, I could barely make them out, but they were there. A voice, calling my name over and over again. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was the wind or the sound of the stream nearby. As the night went on, the others seemed to hear it too. "Okay, seriously, what is that?" Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Jack said, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. "No," Mike said, standing up and shining his flashlight into the trees. "It's not the wind. It's something else." The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized they weren't random sounds. They were voices, soft, murmuring voices that seemed to know exactly where we were. And then I saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, too quick to be an animal. It was tall and thin, its movements unnatural, like it was gliding instead of walking. "Did you see that?" I whispered, gripping Laura's arm. "See what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "There's something out there," I said, pointing toward the trees. Jack stood up, grabbing a stick from the fire. "All right, enough of this. If someone's messing with us, I'll deal with it." "Don't," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "Let's just stay together." But Jack was already walking toward the trees, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello," he called out. "Who's there?" The rest of us huddled around the fire, watching as his light disappeared into the woods. The whispers grew louder, almost like they were laughing at us. "Jack, come back," Laura yelled, her voice cracking. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Jack!" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer. We waited, staring at the dark trees, hoping to see Jack's flashlight. But instead, we saw something else. A figure stepped into the clearing, but it wasn't Jack. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It stood there motionless, watching us. Who are you?" Mike stammered, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its arm and pointed at me. I froze, unable to move or speak. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. And then it smiled. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing all around us. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. We ran, leaving the fire, our tents, and everything behind. The whispers followed us, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. The sun was rising, casting light on the trees. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. We never found Jack. The authorities searched the woods for weeks, but found no trace of him. They said it was probably an animal attack, or that he got lost. But I know what I saw. Something is in those woods. Something that whispers your name and waits for you to follow. I'll never go back. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just 6 of us escaping to the mountains. We had all been stressed from work and school, so Jack suggested we go camping. "It'll be great," he said. "No phones, no noise, just us in nature." The idea sounded perfect. There was me, my best friend Mark, Jack, his girlfriend Emma, and 2 other friends, Lisa and Tom. We had been close for years, and camping trips were a tradition for us. The hike to our campsite was beautiful. The mountains were covered in thick forests, and the air was cool and fresh. We spent the day laughing, telling stories, and stopping to admire the views. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to camp, the sun was beginning to set. The spot was perfect. It was a wide, flat area surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream nearby. We pitched our tents in a circle and built a fire in the middle. As the sky darkened, we sat around the flames, eating and joking. Mark volunteered to collect firewood after dinner. "I saw some fallen branches just down the trail," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Be back in 10 minutes. We all nodded, too busy talking to think much of it. But 10 minutes passed, then 20, and Mark didn't come back. "Where is he?" I asked, frowning. "Probably messing around," Jack said, shrugging. "You know Mark, he likes to scare people. He's probably hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out and make us scream." That sounded like Mark, so we laughed it off. But as the minutes dragged on, I started to feel uneasy. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore." I said, standing up. I'm going to find him. I'll come with you, Lisa said, grabbing a flashlight. The two of us walked down the trail Mark had taken. It was dark, and the beam from the flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. Mark, I called out. Where are you? There was no answer. The forest was silent except for the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. Mark, this isn't funny, Lisa yelled, her voice trembling. We searched for over an hour, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. When we got back to camp, the others were waiting anxiously by the fire. Did you find him? Emma asked, her face pale. I shook my head. No, it's like he's just gone. We need to call someone, Lisa said, pulling out her phone. But there was no signal. Let's not panic, Jack said, though he looked just as scared as the rest of us. He might have gotten turned around. We'll wait until morning and look for him again. That night, none of us slept. We sat around the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made us jump. Around midnight, we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling our camp. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but we couldn't see anyone. Mark, Emma called out, her voice shaking. Is that you? The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard a voice. Help me. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably Mark's voice. Mark, I yelled, running toward the sound. Wait, Jack shouted, grabbing my arm. Don't go out there. It could be someone else. It's him, I said, pulling away. He needs our help. We all ran toward the sound, our flashlights swinging wildly in the darkness. But when we reached the spot where the voice had come from, there was nothing. Just Mark's flashlight, lying on the ground. The next morning, we searched the area again. We split into pairs, calling his name and combing through the forest. But by midday, we had to admit the truth. Mark was gone. We hiked back to the trailhead and called the authorities. Search and rescue teams spent the next week scouring the forest, but they didn't find anything. Not even the flashlight we'd seen the night before. The official report said he must have fallen or gotten lost. But I know that's not true. Because that night, after we had all gone home, I woke up to a sound outside my window. It was faint, but I heard it clearly. Help me. I froze, my heart pounding. It was Mark's voice, but it was wrong, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I ran to the window and looked out. There was nothing there, just the empty street. But I could still hear his voice, whispering my name over and over again. I never went camping again after that. None of us did. To this day, I don't know what happened to Mark. All I know is that something took him. Something from the forest. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear his voice. I've always loved hiking. It's peaceful and gives me a break from the constant noise of the city. I usually hike with friends, but that weekend, I decided to go alone. It was meant to be a quiet escape, just me, nature, and my thoughts. The trail I chose was deep in the mountains, far from crowded paths. It was an 8-mile loop, and I planned to spend the night halfway through, then finish the hike the next day. The first few hours were perfect. The trail wound through dense woods, with sunlight filtering through the leaves. Birds chirped above me, and the smell of pine filled the air. I felt completely at ease, like I had left all my worries behind. But by the time I reached the halfway point, dark clouds had gathered overhead. The wind picked up, and I knew a storm was coming. I had no choice but to find shelter. That's when I saw it. The cabin stood a little off the trail, hidden behind a cluster of trees. It looked old and abandoned, with its roof sagging and the wood darkened by years of weather. It wasn't marked on any maps I'd seen, but I didn't have time to think about that. The first drops of rain were already falling. I hesitated at the door. Something about the cabin felt wrong. The air around it was heavy, and the forest was eerily quiet, like all the animals had fled. But the rain was coming down harder now, and I didn't have a tent. I told myself I was being silly. It was just an old cabin. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty. The air smelled like damp wood and mildew. There was a single room with a dusty wooden floor and walls covered in strange carvings. Circles, triangles, and shapes I didn't recognize were etched into the wood, along with deep scratches that looked like claw marks. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, facing a corner. The sight of it made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't say why. I set my backpack down and unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the chair. Rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled outside, but the cabin held firm. It was shelter, I reminded myself. That's all that mattered. But as night fell, I started to feel uneasy. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the flickering light of my flashlight. The scratches looked deeper, more jagged. The chair in the corner seemed closer, though I hadn't touched it. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was tired from hiking, and the storm outside was making me jumpy. I turned off my flashlight and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps above me. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were slow and deliberate, too heavy to be a raccoon or a squirrel. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped directly above me. My heart pounded in my chest. The cabin didn't have a second floor. I sat up, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps started again, this time moving toward the wall. I stared at the ceiling, my breath caught in my throat. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for the sound of rain. Then the laughter began. It was low and raspy, coming from all around me. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. I scrambled to my feet, shining my flashlight in every direction. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped. I stood there, trembling, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. That's when I noticed the chair. It was no longer facing the corner. It was facing me. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to leave, but the storm was still raging outside, and I didn't know if I could find the trail in the dark. The chair creaked, as if someone had just sat down in it. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was sitting in the chair. It was shadowy and indistinct, like it was made of smoke. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it was watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. "Leave," it whispered, its voice low and gravelly. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my backpack and bolted for the door. As I ran, the laughter started again, louder and more manic. The carvings on the walls seemed to glow in the darkness, and the scratches looked like they were moving, growing deeper. I burst out of the cabin into the pouring rain. I didn't stop running, didn't look back. The storm soaked me to the bone, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sun was starting to rise. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. My legs were shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I looked back at the trail, half expecting to see the figure from the cabin standing there. But the path was empty, the forest silent. I never went back to that trail. I don't even hike anymore. Sometimes, I wonder if the cabin is still there, hidden in the woods, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. I wonder if they'll hear the footsteps, the laughter, the whispered warnings. But most of all, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I had camped in bad weather before, but nothing prepared me for what we went through on Death Canyon Shelf. It was late in the season, dry summer, and we knew we were pushing our luck with the unpredictable mountain conditions. But the Tetons had always been on our list, and we finally had the time to do it. My husband and I packed light, planning to cover a lot of ground each day. We had read every trail report we could find, checked the weather, and prepared for the usual risks: thin air, long days, and unpredictable storms. But we had no idea what we were walking into. The first real problem hit on the ascent to the pass. It was brutally hot, at least 90 degrees, and my husband's pack was far heavier than mine. He was the stronger hiker, so he took most of the load, extra food, the tent, cookware. He insisted he was fine, but I could see how much he was sweating. His shirt was soaked through. He drank as much water as he could spare, but we both knew we had to ration it. The heat was relentless, and the air felt thin. As we climbed higher, we passed multiple streams marked on the map. Every single one was bone dry. What should have been a reliable water source was nothing but cracked earth and dead grass. He kept checking his bottle, swishing the water around, probably counting every last drop. Then the clouds started to build. At first, they were distant, just soft wisps creeping in from the horizon. But within minutes, they thickened, darkened. My husband's pace picked up. He had always been cautious about lightning above the tree line, and I knew what was going through his head. Out here, fully exposed, we were easy targets. "Slow down," I wanted to say, but I knew he wouldn't. His breathing was heavy, his steps uneven. His pack, heavy with gear, dragged him down. He was overheating. And then he stumbled. He caught himself, barely, but I saw the dizziness in his eyes. We still had at least a mile to go before the next marked water source. A thick, bold blue line on the map. It had to be there. I made the call. I set him down in a shady spot, took his empty bottles, and told him to wait. I'd be back soon. I hiked as fast as I could, heart pounding, trying to ignore how dry my own throat felt. If this next stream was dry too, we were in real trouble. I reached the spot, and relief hit me like a wave. The water was there. Not a rushing river, but enough. Cold, clear, moving water. I crouched down, hands shaking as I pulled out the filter. I worked quickly, filling one bottle, then another. I was so focused on the water, I almost didn't hear it. A soft rustling. A breath. I looked up. Not 20 feet away, across the stream, a brown head rose from the tall grass. Then another. And another. A grizzly. A mother with cubs. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew better. I stood up slowly, making myself as big as possible. Raised my arms. I made noise, just like I had read. Firm, steady. No panic. No screaming. The mother bear locked eyes with me, ears up, body tense. She was assessing me. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. She grunted, sniffed the air. I kept talking, stepping back slowly, inching away from the water. She watched. Then, just like that, she turned, nudged her cubs toward the brush. They disappeared. I stood there, heart hammering, barely believing I was still alive. Then I grabbed the bottles and ran back to my husband. That night, we set up camp on Death Canyon Shelf, exhausted, shaken, but grateful we were still standing. The temperature dropped fast. The dry heat of the day vanished, replaced by an eerie chill. We bundled up, crawled into the tent, and tried to rest. Then the storm hit. It started with wind, gusts so strong they bent the tent poles. Then came the thunder, loud, rolling, echoing off the cliffs. And the lightning. It was nonstop. Flash after flash, so bright it felt like daylight. The air reeked of ozone, sharp and electric. We crouched low, minimizing contact with the ground, doing everything we could to avoid becoming human lightning rods. Then we noticed the brightness wasn't just the lightning anymore. It was snow. In less than 30 minutes, for inches had fallen. The entire world outside the tent had transformed into a blinding, white expanse. We had gone from summer heat to full winter in a matter of hours. The temperature kept dropping. Our gear wasn't built for this kind of cold. I started shivering, teeth chattering, fingers stiff. My husband wrapped his sleeping bag around me, trying to share warmth. I pressed against him, focusing on my breathing, forcing myself to stay awake. Hypothermia was a real threat. If we fell asleep, we might not wake up. We sat like that for hours, listening to the storm rage, feeling the weight of the snow pressing down on our tent. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the damage was done. The ground was buried in snow, and our bodies were stiff with cold. We packed up quickly, moving as fast as we could to generate warmth. Every step down the mountain felt treacherous, snow-covered rocks, patches of ice, hidden crevices. Then, as if the mountains hadn't punished us enough, the hail started. Tiny, sharp pellets hammering down, bouncing off the rocks, stinging our skin. We pulled our hoods tight and kept moving, the trail slick beneath our boots. By the time we reached lower elevation, the snow had vanished, replaced by mud and wet earth. The sun was shining, as if none of it had ever happened. We finally reached the car, threw our packs in the trunk, and sat in silence for a long time. No words, just deep, steady breaths. We had survived. It was the best trip we had ever taken, but it was also the scariest. Every single day had pushed us to our limits. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, a bear encounter, a lightning storm, sudden snow, hypothermia, hail. It had tested our endurance, our instincts, our ability to keep going when everything told us to turn back. And yet, we wouldn't have traded it for anything. That's the thing about the mountains. They don't care about your plans. They don't care how prepared you think you are. They'll break you down, scare you, push you further than you thought possible. And if you're lucky, they'll let you walk away. We were lucky. I was part of a backpacking group trekking through North Carolina in 2018. The trip had been planned for months. and I had been excited to push myself. We were deep in the backcountry, moving through rugged terrain, miles from the nearest road. It was the third day, and we had reached one of the high points of our trip, Pilot Mountain. Not the famous one, but the smaller one. For some reason, North Carolina had two of them. We reached the summit in the late morning, around midday. The air was cool, crisp, and still. The view was incredible, rolling hills and dense forest stretched for miles. We dropped our heavy packs and took a break, pulling out snacks, stretching, and taking photos. I felt fine. Tired, sure, but that was expected. I had been keeping up well enough, eating when I needed to, drinking plenty of water. After a while, the guide signaled it was time to head back down. We adjusted our gear and started our descent. The trail was steep, winding between exposed rock and dense tree cover. It required careful footing, and I was focused on my steps when I suddenly felt lightheaded. I paused, thinking I just needed a second to reorient myself. But then, bam! It hit me like a wave. A full-on vertigo attack. My vision blurred, my balance vanished, and I crumpled onto the dirt trail, my stomach twisting violently. Before I could even register what was happening, I was vomiting uncontrollably violently. My body was rejecting everything inside me. I could hear the sounds of the others stopping, turning, voices muffled through the static in my head. My arms shook as I tried to push myself up, but the moment I lifted my head, the nausea slammed into me again. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time had lost meaning. I was only aware of the overwhelming dizziness, the spinning, and the awful sensation of my body betraying me. When I tried to move, the world lurched in the wrong direction, sending me crashing back down. The guide kneeled next to me, pressing a hand on my shoulder to keep me from rolling down the trail. I wasn't getting better. I wasn't stabilizing. This wasn't just dehydration or exhaustion. Something was seriously wrong. After nearly an hour, the lead guide made the call. Everyone else would continue down to camp, while a few of them stayed with me to wait for rescue. It was the only option. The temperatures were dropping fast, and if they waited with me, the entire group would be at risk. The rest of them reluctantly continued down the mountain while I lay there, curled up against the cold dirt, trying not to move, because every movement sent a fresh wave of sickness crashing over me. Then came the waiting. The guide stayed right beside me, trying to keep me warm while we waited for an EMT to arrive. The minutes dragged. I could feel the temperature dropping, the air growing sharper against my skin. The sun was starting to slip lower in the sky. My clothes were damp with sweat, making the cold sink deeper into my bones. An hour later, the EMT finally reached us. The man was calm, professional, and immediately began assessing my condition. I was barely responsive at this point, my body weak and shivering. I could barely hold my head up, let alone answer questions. They had no choice but to hook me up to N4, trying to stabilize me enough to be moved. But the 4 fluids, while necessary, made things worse. They were cooling my body temperature even further, accelerating my decline. I was lying there on the freezing ground, shaking uncontrollably, growing weaker by the second, while the rescue team worked their way up from below, literally chainsawing a path through the dense brush to get a stretcher up the mountain. It was slow, brutal work, and I was running out of time. My condition wasn't improving. The EMT and the guide made the call. A helicopter would be put on standby. Darkness fell. The air temperature plummeted. What had been a relatively mild day in the 50s or 60s was now dropping fast, heading for the teens. I could feel the cold sinking deep, my muscles cramping, my breathing growing shallow. My body was shutting down. The EMT kept checking my pulse, my responsiveness, my temperature. He knew it. I knew it. Another hour passed. My mind started to slip. I was struggling to focus, struggling to keep my eyes open. The EMT was still talking to me, but his voice was distant, warped. The cold was numbing me completely. The rescue team was still hacking their way up the mountain, fighting through fallen trees and thick brush. Every second counted, and they were racing against time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached me. I was strapped onto the stretcher, my body barely responding, and they began the agonizing process of carrying me down. The team moved with as much speed as they could manage, but the terrain was brutal, the darkness making everything more dangerous. I could feel myself being lifted, carried, then set down as they navigated obstacles. The sky above was an inky black void. The only light came from their headlamps, flashing across the trees. At some point, the stretcher was transferred to an ATV. The vibrations rattled through my bones, but I was too far gone to react. My body was shutting down, every muscle aching, every joint stiff. I remember seeing flashes of light through the trees as the ATV bounced and jolted its way down the rugged path. Then the ambulance doors, the bright, sterile lights, voices, motion. I was rushed to the hospital where they ran test after test, CT scans, heart attack screenings, blood work. Hours passed. I was still weak, barely able to sit up, my limbs heavy and useless. And then, at 3 a.m., they told me I was being released. I stared at them in disbelief. I wasn't even able to walk. The dizziness was still there, the weakness, the nausea. And yet, they were sending me out into the night. They offered to call a cab, but that was it. I would be on my own to figure out where to go, how to get there, how to survive the night. I remember the helplessness, the frustration, the deep, gnawing fear. And then kindness. A nurse, one of the night staff, took pity on me. She waited until the others were gone, then quietly helped me into an empty room. She brought me water, snacks, let me rest until morning. She didn't have to. She could have just followed orders and left me to fend for myself. But she didn't. That night, so many people saved my life. The guide who stayed behind, the EMT who fought to keep me stable, the rescue team that cut their way through the wilderness in the freezing dark, the nurse who gave me shelter when no one else would. When morning came, my backpacking group finally returned for me. They helped me out of the hospital, got me back on my feet, made sure I wasn't alone. I wasn't fully recovered yet, but I was alive, and I owed that to them. Palo Duro Canyon is one of those places that can make you feel completely alone, even when you aren't. It's vast, dry, and empty, stretching out for miles with deep red rock, endless desert, and jagged cliffs that look like something out of another world. The landscape is rugged, unforgiving. Beautiful, but in a way that reminds you how small you are, how fragile. I had been camping there for a few days, enjoying the isolation. I liked pushing myself, getting off the beaten path, exploring places most people didn't bother to go. That day, I had gone several miles off the official trails, hiking up through loose, dry clay and rock formations, where the land cracked open in strange ways, forming narrow ravines and small caves. The kind of place where you could get lost, and no one would ever find you. It was hot. The sun pressed down like a weight, and my clothes were already covered in dust. Every step sent a little slide of loose pebbles and dry dirt skittering down the canyon walls. I was careful, watching my footing, keeping an eye on the way back, so I wouldn't get turned around. But even then, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. 1 second, I was stepping forward, shifting my weight onto what I thought was solid ground. The next, the earth crumbled beneath me. It wasn't a slow collapse. There was no time to react, no moment of realizing what was happening before I was already going down. The clay and rock gave way in an instant, and I was falling, sliding. My hands shot out, scrambling for something to grab, but the walls around me were smooth, dry, offering no hold. I barely had time to process before my backpack slammed into the narrowing walls of the chute, jamming me in place. My whole body lurched against the straps, and for a second, I thought they might snap. But they held, stopping my fall just as my legs dangled over an unseen drop below. I froze. For a long moment, all I could do was breathe, my chest rising and falling in short, panicked bursts. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I could hear the sound of loose dirt and pebbles tumbling into the darkness below me, clicking and clattering against stone. It was impossible to tell how far down it went. Maybe just a few feet. Maybe farther. Maybe far enough that I wouldn't be getting back out. I tried to shift, but the dry clay was like powder beneath me, making it impossible to get a grip. My feet scraped uselessly against the walls. Every little movement sent more dirt sliding downward, making me slip just a little farther before my backpack caught me again. This was bad. This was worse than bad. I was several miles off trail in a remote part of the canyon, in an area that was full of these kinds of formations. If I went down any farther, if I slipped past the point of no return, no one would ever find me. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. Even if they started searching, there were 100 different places I could be. 100 different holes just like this one. The thought sent a wave of panic through me. My arms tensed, my muscles locking up as I fought to stay as still as possible, trying not to shift my weight in the wrong direction. My backpack was wedged tight, but I could already feel it slipping bit by bit as the loose dirt continued to shift beneath me. I had to get out. Now, I started trying to shimmy upward, pushing with my legs, bracing my arms against the walls, but the clay was too soft, too dry. Every push just sent more dirt crumbling away, and I kept sliding back down. The angle of the chute was steep enough that there was no solid footing. The air was hot and dry. My throat felt like sandpaper, my skin slick with sweat despite the dust. My muscles were starting to shake from the effort. I stopped for a second, breathing hard, trying to force my mind to clear. I needed to think. There had to be a way. The chute wasn't a straight drop, more of a narrow, sloping crack in the earth, jagged enough that there were tiny ridges along the walls. If I could get enough leverage, if I could wedge my feet in the right way, I might be able to push myself up little by little. I adjusted my position, ignoring the burning ache in my shoulders from the straps digging into them. Slowly, I twisted, trying to plant my boots against the opposite wall. I pressed hard, pushing up, shifting my weight, then using my arms to pull myself just an inch higher. The clay shifted under me, but this time I didn't slip all the way back down. I kept going. Every inch was a battle. I was using muscles I didn't even know I had, my whole body trembling from the strain. My hands scraped against the rough clay, my fingers aching, my legs cramping. But slowly, so slowly, I was making progress. Then my backpack slipped. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of dirt sliding down. I gritted my teeth, adjusting my grip, forcing myself to keep going. Time blurred. It felt like hours. Maybe it was. My world had shrunk down to nothing but the narrow chute, the burning in my muscles, the desperate focus on each tiny movement upward. I wasn't thinking about anything else. Couldn't afford to. And then light. Not much. Just a sliver, just enough to tell me I was almost there. I forced myself up another few inches. Another. My fingers clawed at the edge of the opening, finding nothing but loose dirt. My heart pounded as I dug in, trying to pull myself over the lip. The earth crumbled beneath my grip, threatening to send me tumbling back down, but I wasn't going to let that happen. With a final push, a last desperate heave, I dragged myself out. I collapsed on solid ground, my chest heaving, my body shaking so hard I thought I might throw up. The sky stretched wide above me, the hot sun burning down, the open desert stretching in every direction. I was out. I was safe. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the sky, my body too exhausted to move. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my arms and legs limp and useless. Every inch of me was covered in dust and sweat. Eventually, I forced myself up, still shaking. My body felt unsteady, my muscles weak, but I had to keep moving. I had to get back to camp. I looked around, trying to memorize the spot, the exact place where the ground had given way beneath me. It was just a crack in the earth, barely noticeable among the red clay and rocks. A few steps in another direction, and I would have missed it entirely. A few inches deeper, and I wouldn't have made it back out. When I finally got back to camp, I tried to go back, tried to find the hole again to show my wife what had almost killed me. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find it. It was gone, or maybe it was never meant to be found. I've camped in bad weather before. I've had cold nights, wet nights, and windy nights. But none of them, not a single one, came close to that night. The night the storm came through and changed the forest into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. I had checked the forecast before heading out. There had been a chance of storms, but nothing that had seemed too bad. Just some scattered thunderstorms, typical summer weather. I'd been through plenty of those. I wasn't worried. I had my tent, my gear, and my experience. I knew what I was doing. The spot I picked was a small, open-sided pavilion in the middle of the woods. A structure meant for picnics, maybe small gatherings, but long since abandoned to the elements. A concrete floor, for posts holding up a metal roof, and a couple of old wooden picnic tables. It wasn't perfect, but it was shelter. Good enough for me. I set up my tent in the middle of the pavilion, figuring that would give me the best protection from the wind and any debris. The forest around me was dense, packed with old trees that towered over everything. I liked it that way, isolated, quiet, peaceful. I had a small fire going just outside the pavilion, enough to cook some food and warm up a bit. As the sun set, I sat there, listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, the occasional rustling of something in the brush, maybe a deer moving through. Normal sounds. But then the wind started to pick up. It was slow at first, just a gentle push against the trees. I watched as the branches swayed, listened as the leaves whispered against one another. It felt normal, but then it changed. The wind came in heavier gusts, sudden and forceful. The trees groaned, their massive trunks flexing under the pressure. My fire sputtered, the flames twisting and struggling to stay alive. Then I heard it, a deep, rolling roar in the distance, like thunder, but not quite. It was steady, growing louder by the second. I turned my head, listening, trying to understand what I was hearing. It wasn't thunder. It was wind, a wall of wind, de derecho. By the time I realized what was happening, it was already on me. The trees exploded into movement, their tops whipping back and forth like blades of grass. The sound was deafening, a constant howl mixed with the sharp cracks of branches snapping like toothpicks. The sky darkened, and I saw debris flying past. Leaves, twigs, whole branches ripped from trees and sent spiraling through the air. I barely had time to react. I rushed to my tent, yanked the rainfly tight, and crouched inside, trying to keep everything together. The pavilion shook, the metal roof rattling violently above me. I could hear the forest being torn apart, trees breaking, falling, crashing into each other. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, over the wind, I heard something else. A deep, guttural huff. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws clicking against concrete. I wasn't alone. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I strained my ears, listening, barely breathing. The wind howled around me, but underneath it, I heard the sharp, rhythmic tapping of claws against the pavilion floor. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. My mind raced. A bear. A big one, judging by the weight of its steps. It had come in for the same reason I had, shelter. But now it was pacing, circling, confused and agitated. The storm had riled it up, sent it into a panic. And I was trapped in the middle of it. The bear moved closer, sniffing, grunting. I could hear its heavy breath, the way it huffed in frustration. It wasn't leaving. It was trying to figure out what I was doing there. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I reached for my hunting knife, my hands shaking. I had nothing else. No gun, no bear spray. Just a knife. And if it came to that, I knew how that fight would end. The bear kept circling, moving just outside my tent. I could hear its claws scrape against the concrete, hear the low rumble of its breath. It was close. Too close. Then suddenly it let out a sharp, angry huff and stomped away. For a brief moment, I let myself hope. Maybe the storm had scared it off. Maybe it had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Then the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. It was running in circles. Fast. It left the pavilion for a moment, then charged back in, its claws clicking against the floor as it tore through the space. Over and over. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. It was frantic, its movements erratic. The storm had sent it into a full-blown panic, and I was stuck in the middle of it. I gripped my knife tighter, then did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my roll of duct tape and started wrapping it around my hand, securing the knife so I wouldn't drop it. My fingers were shaking so badly, I could barely get the tape to stick. I worked fast, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. If it charged me, I wasn't going to be able to fight it off. But if I had to go down, I wasn't going to do it empty-handed. The wind howled around us, the pavilion shaking violently. I heard another crack, another tree going down somewhere nearby. The ground trembled with the impact. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The bear froze. I could hear it panting, could feel its presence just outside my tent. The air was thick with tension, with unspoken fear. Then slowly it backed away. Its claws scraped against the floor one last time, and then it was gone. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there, gripping my knife, waiting, listening. The wind had died down, the forest eerily silent. The storm had passed. When I finally crawled out of my tent, the pavilion was covered in debris. Leaves, branches, dirt scattered everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of rain and broken wood. Outside the pavilion, the forest was unrecognizable. Trees lay twisted and broken, the ground littered with splintered trunks. My fire pit was gone, buried under a mess of fallen limbs. I looked around, my whole body still shaking. The bear was gone. The storm was over. But the forest would never be the same. I never camped in that spot again. Camping was something we did a lot when I was a kid. Even though I grew up in Wyoming, for some reason, we always went to Colorado when we wanted to sleep in a tent and cook over a fire. I never thought much about why. It was just what we did. By the time I was 12, I had been on more camping trips than I could count. It was just normal. Pack up the station wagon, load the cooler with whatever Mom decided we were eating, and hit the road. It wasn't anything special. This trip wasn't supposed to be special either. It was early summer, and the nights were still cold, especially up in the mountains where the air was thin and sharp. My younger brother and I shared a tent, while my parents took the other one. We were camped near a small stream, far enough off the main road that it felt like we were the only people in the world. No sounds of cars, no city lights, just the dark outline of trees against the sky and the slow, distant rush of water somewhere in the blackness. That night, I woke up shivering. I wasn't sure what time it was, but it was still pitch black outside the tent, and my sleeping bag felt like it wasn't doing much to keep the cold out. I decided I was going to the car. It would be warmer in there, and I didn't feel like trying to fall asleep again while my teeth were chattering. I moved carefully, trying not to wake up my brother as I unzipped my bag and grabbed it to take with me. But of course he stirred. He always did. He was a little pest, always trailing after me no matter where I went. "I gotta pee," he muttered. I rolled my eyes. He always had to do whatever I was doing. I doubted he actually had to go, but I wasn't about to argue in the middle of the night. We crawled out of the tent, and the air hit me like a slap, cold and dry, biting at my face and hands. But something was different. The sky wasn't completely dark anymore. There was a glow on the horizon, a deep red stretching across the tops of the mountains. For a second, I thought it was the sun coming up. I stood there, staring, trying to shake off the last bit of sleep and make sense of it. My brother, always full of opinions, immediately pointed out that the sun didn't rise in that direction. I didn't want to admit he was right, so I argued just because that's what older siblings do. But the glow wasn't fading or shifting like a sunrise. It wasn't that soft, warm light that slowly creeps in over the horizon. It was solid, too red, too strong, and it was spreading. That's when Dad stuck his head out of the tent, probably ready to yell at us for making too much noise. But instead, he just stared. Then, in one quick movement, he was out of the tent and grabbing Mom by the shoulder. "Get up," he said. His voice was sharp, tight. Now, Mom was groggy, confused, but Dad didn't give her time to argue. He was already yanking at the tent poles, collapsing the whole thing with everything still inside. That's when I realized what was happening. It was fire. A wildfire. The realization hit like a punch. The glow wasn't morning light. It was flames, tearing through the trees somewhere in the distance, hidden behind the ridge. The smoke hadn't reached us yet, but it would. And if the fire was coming this way, we didn't have much time. Dad didn't tell us to pack anything. He didn't give us instructions beyond one thing: move. Fast. We shoved the flattened tent and whatever else we could grab into the back of the station wagon. There was no time to fold things, no time to make sure we had everything. Sleeping bags, backpacks, whatever wasn't already loaded just got thrown in, loose and messy. I climbed into the back seat, pressing my face to the window as Dad started the car and peeled out of the campsite. The road was nothing but gravel and dirt, narrow and winding, with nothing but open air and sheer drop-offs on one side. In the daylight, it had looked rugged, beautiful. Now it felt like a death trap. The car bounced hard over the rough terrain, and every few seconds, I could hear things shifting, knocking around in the back. My brother sat rigid beside me, silent for once. I could see his hands gripping the seatbelt, knuckles white. Mom kept looking out the back window, eyes scanning the sky, but I didn't have to see it to know what was coming. The glow was getting brighter. Then came the smoke. At first, it was just a haze, a thin film creeping over the tops of the trees. Then it thickened. The smell hit me before the full weight of it did, sharp, bitter, something deeper than just wood burning. It smelled like earth, like dry pine needles, like something ancient being ripped apart. The road twisted, dipped. Gravel crunched under the tires. Dad's hands were tight on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Every once in a while, the tires slid just enough to make my stomach lurch, but he never let up. We hadn't been driving long when headlights appeared ahead of us, cutting through the thickening smoke. A truck. As we got closer, I could see the markings, green and white. A game warden. The truck slowed, flashing its lights at us. Dad braked hard, sending up a cloud of dust as we came to a stop. The warden climbed out, his uniform barely visible through the haze. He and Dad exchanged quick words, too quick for me to catch much, but I heard enough. The fire was moving fast. They were evacuating campsites. We had time to get out, but not much. The warden waved us on. Dad hit the gas. The next stretch of road was worse. The smoke thickened, turning the world into a tunnel of shifting gray. The headlights barely cut through it. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, a steady beat of fear. The fire itself never came into view. Just the smoke, the glow, the suffocating sense of something closing in behind us. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. The drive back to civilization felt like hours, but it was probably less than one. Eventually, the road smoothed out, the trees thinned, and the air got clearer. Only when we hit pavement did Dad ease up on the gas. The smoke was still visible in the rearview mirror, but we weren't in it anymore. No one spoke much on the way home. Mom rubbed her temples like she had a headache. My brother sat still, staring straight ahead. I watched the horizon, waiting for the glow to disappear completely. It was only when we finally pulled into our driveway that I realized my hands were shaking. I still think about that fire sometimes, about how close we were, how quickly things changed from just another camping trip to something I still feel a deep, quiet fear about. Whenever I see footage of wildfires now, houses burning, trees turned to black skeletons, people driving through walls of smoke trying to escape, I feel it again. That cold, creeping fear at the base of my skull. The same one I felt in the back of the station wagon, staring out at the road, hoping we were going to make it. And every time, I remember just how fast it all happened. How one moment, I was just a kid crawling out of a tent, and the next, I was running from fire.